Thank you very much. I appreciate being here in Louisville, which I passed through on the research I was doing for the book, Land of Lincoln. I suppose I should always say at the beginning of one of these talks that the reason I became a writer was so I wouldn't have to be a talker. But of course, this was before I had this blindingly original insight that no one had ever had before, which is I would write a book about Abraham Lincoln. I guess the reason one of the reasons I did this was there was many signs in my life always sort of pointing me towards Lincoln. I grew up in Illinois, which of course is the land of Lincoln. I lived in a house on Lincoln Street, just down from a house where it was famous in the neighborhood because Lincoln had spent the night there once in the 1850s. My father was a lawyer in a law firm called Isham, Lincoln and Beale, which was founded by Lincoln's only surviving son. So I thought, well, these were all signs pointing me to write this book. Of course, sometimes these signs are wrong. I'm reminded of this, the old story about the traveling businessman who wakes up in his hotel one morning and the clock is flashing 5:55 and he realizes he's in room 55 on the 5th floor and he's going to a meeting on 55 5th Street. So he runs downstairs and gets in a cab, and the cab fare is $5 and he tips the guy $5. He gets in the 55 5th Street and he goes up the elevator to the 5th floor where the meeting is, and there are 5 people there, and he says, geez, you know, I'm getting a message here. So he runs out to the racetrack, runs up to the window, puts down, says, I want $5,000 in the 5th race on horse number 5, and of course the horse comes in 5th. Well, this was something like this I think might have happened to me, but I noticed that because the field is so crowded of Lincoln books, the first question that any Lincoln author has to answer is, why write another one? Which is a nice way of saying, how dare you write another one? More than 14,000 books have been written about Abraham Lincoln, which places him just below Jesus, Napoleon, and Madonna in the number of books. In fact, I got a sense of how crowded the field was. Early on in my research, I was in Springfield, Illinois, and at a Lincoln conference. There's always a Lincoln conference going on in Springfield, which of course is his own hometown. And the room was full of about 100, Lincoln buffs and scholars and enthusiasts and historians and people in off the street. And the moderator suddenly stopped and he said, just out of curiosity, how many people in this room are writing a book about Abraham Lincoln? And half the people in the room raised their hand, which is not at all encouraging to someone who is about to start to write a book. But I suppose I shouldn't have been surprised. But in another way, I was, because I was, what possibly more could there be to say about Lincoln? And it turns out actually quite a lot. Just in the last few years, we've had a book about Lincoln's sex life, his psychological depressions, his finances, his economic views, his religious beliefs, his political techniques, his prose style, his vacation house. Honest to God, there was 2 books published within a year of each other about the house where Lincoln spent his summer vacation. There's one about, my favorite is about his eating habits. It's a 300-page book called The Taste is in My Mouth a Little, and it has every documented instance of when Lincoln ate and what he liked. It turns out he liked biscuits. I mean, who knew? This is actually a book done by a very good Lincoln historian named Wayne Temple, who is also the author of a seminal work on Lincoln's pets. One consequence I immediately noticed of this Lincoln glut is that we're running out of titles. We Lincoln authors, every memorable phrase from his speeches has been used, with malice toward none, with charity for all, a new birth of freedom conceived in liberty, to bind up the nation's wounds, of the people, by the people, for the people. Just in the last few years, we've had a book called The Sword of Lincoln and another one called Lincoln's Sword. There's the Lincoln nobody knows and the Lincoln no one knows. There's Lincoln's generals, Lincoln and the generals, Lincoln and Grant, Grant and Lincoln. There's the inner world of Abraham Lincoln, the intimate world of Abraham Lincoln, Abraham Lincoln's world, and of course Abraham Lincoln's intimate world. There's Lincoln's virtues and the virtuous Lincoln. There's in Lincoln's footsteps, in the footsteps of the Lincolns, and for variety's sake, in Lincoln's footprints. And at last count, there were at least 3 books titled The Real Lincoln. I suppose it goes without saying that the Lincoln in each of those books was utterly different from the Lincoln portrayed in the other 2. In fact, that's one of the things that inspired my own book, Land of Lincoln, which is not to be confused with The Living Land of Lincoln, which was published 6 years ago by Thomas Fleming. Over the last generation or so, there seemed to be so many Lincolns running around. Everyone seemed to have his own. I mentioned I was a Lincoln buff as a kid, and from this huge universal icon that I remembered from my youth, this looming presence in American life, he seemed to have been shrunk or cut down to size or cut to fit everyone's own individual needs and preconceptions. It was as though this great national treasure had been privatized. And once again, you see it in the books. Just in the last few years, you know, it's been said that over the years, Americans love to tell their children to be like Lincoln, kind, resolute, principled. But what we really wanted is for Lincoln to be like us. You see it in these books. There's a book just out a couple of years ago proving that Lincoln was a fundamentalist Christian, which was, of course, written by a fundamentalist Christian. There's another that proved that Lincoln's greatness lay in his struggle with clinical depression, which was written by a journalist who struggled with clinical depression. Most famous of all, of course, was the book in 2005 proving that Lincoln was an active homosexual, written by a homosexual activist. We've even had a book arguing that if Lincoln were alive today, his political views would be indistinguishable from those of Mario Cuomo's. And guess who wrote that one? But what I wanted to know was, wasn't there a Lincoln, a universal Lincoln that we could all lay claim to and draw inspiration from as earlier generations had? And I thought I could get to him by going through the people who obsess over him, who hate him, revere him, imitate him, study him, teach him, collect him. One of my first stops was in Chicago, and I found there what I thought was a perfect example of Lincoln's staying power. Chicago has a close Lincoln connection. He visited there many times in the 1850s. It's a town where he was nominated for president. Chicago was also the home in the late 19th century of Jane Addams, who some of you may be familiar with, the great progressive reformer of the 19th century, who founded Hull House on the city's west side to act as sort of an intake valve for the massive waves of immigrants who were coming into the country from Central Europe and Ireland. She was also one of the first great Lincoln buffs. She was obsessed with Lincoln, and she wanted to use Lincoln by holding them up to these new Americans coming in as an icon, as an exemplar of what an American should be. She wanted to Americanize them, was her word, which you don't hear often anymore. So at Hull House, they celebrated Lincoln's birthday. They held Lincoln parties. They drew pictures of him, wrote poems about him at Christmas while the neighborhood kids were clamoring for toys and candy. She would instead give them each a biography of Abraham Lincoln. They must have been thrilled.